Dean, I volunteered to transfer to the branch in the new economic zone. Florence, are you sure about this? It's at least 5 years before you can come back from this transfer. The dean confirmed again and again, and Florence, suppressing the bitterness in her eyes, nodded firmly. I've thought it through. Now that the southern part of our country needs to be developed, I'll go to the south. The dean sighed. Don't you want to discuss this with Dr. Tyler and your family? At the mention of Tyler, Florence's heart ached. Since her sister returned to China and moved in with her parents and Tyler has been absent-minded. Florence felt like she was back in childhood, with everyone in the family revolving around her sister Georgia. Tyler had sworn to give her a home, but he broke his promise. However, she wouldn't have to worry about it in a week. Her future belongs to her and the child in her belly. Tyler, let's just leave him in the past. 1. In 2000, at the First People's Hospital of J City. Dean, I've made up my mind. I want to volunteer to be transferred to the branch hospital in the new economic zone. The dean was surprised. Taking off his glasses, he walked to the desk. Florence, are you sure about this? You're from J City, and the new economic zone is very far away. This transfer means you won't be able to come back for at least 5 years. I've thought it through. Now that the southern part of our country needs to be developed, I'll go to the south. Under the light, Florence suppressed the bitterness in her eyes and nodded firmly. The dean hesitated for a moment. Don't you need to discuss this with Dr. Tyler and your family? At the mention of Tyler, Florence's heart ached. She gave the dean a kind lie. I've already discussed it with my family, and they all support me. All right, since your family has no objections, I'll arrange the transfer order for you. After thanking the dean and leaving the office, Florence met Nurse Hazel, who was teary-eyed and full of heartache. Hazel held her hand, her eyes filled with reluctance and heartache. Are you really sure you want to leave alone? What about the baby in your belly? I can raise the child by myself. Florence touched her still flat belly and smiled faintly. Besides, isn't there a new technology at the branch hospital? Maybe it can cure the old injury on my arm, and then I can go back to the operating table. At the mention of Florence's old injury, Nurse Hazel's eyes were filled with deep regret. Florence's arm was slashed by a family member during a medical dispute. There were 2 surgical masters in the hospital. One was Tyler, and the other was Florence. 3 years ago, Tyler was harassed by an emotionally agitated family member during a surgery and was even threatened with a knife. Florence, who was on duty at the time, unhesitatingly stood in front of Tyler, and her arm was slashed. Later, the patient was fine, and Tyler was also safe and sound, firmly holding the position of the hospital's top surgeon. Only Florence lost the opportunity to pick up the scalpel from then on. To repay her, Tyler married Florence as his wife. For 3 years of marriage, he was kind and considerate to her in every way. The two became a model couple that everyone in the hospital envied. But only Florence knew that her husband didn't love her. He married her only because of her life-saving grace. Tyler loved only one person, her sister Georgia. He just kept deceiving himself after marriage, trying to love Florence and forget about Georgia. Tyler would prepare gifts for her on every holiday, but those gifts were not what Florence liked. Tyler would call the wrong name in the dead of night, and the sound of Georgia kept echoing in Florence's ears. Tyler would also kneel in front of Florence and swear, "I, Tyler, will only love Florence for the rest of my life. If I violate this oath, I will be struck by lightning." Just when Florence was about to believe it, Georgia returned to China. That day, Dr. Tyler, who was always steady and composed, seemed like a different person. He didn't care about anything else and drove the hospital car directly to the airport to pick her up. He left a mess for Florence to clean up. From that day on, the sister came back with her parents and moved into the house she shared with Tyler. And from that day on, all of Tyler's attention was on his sister. Everyone in the family revolved around Georgia alone. Sometimes when Florence returned home, she would be dazed, wondering whose home it really was. Tyler noticed her loss. He still maintained the image of a model husband in front of outsiders. But he would say to her in private, "Don't be so petty. Georgia is just here to recuperate." It's just that Tyler would never know that the day Georgia returned to China was also the day Florence found out she was pregnant. Tyler had always wanted a child for 3 years of marriage, and now his wish came true. But Florence had no intention of letting him know. After finishing the night shift, Florence shivered uncontrollably in the cold wind. It was colder today, and Tyler had promised to pick her up, but in the end, he still broke his promise. Florence watched her colleagues being picked up by their families one by one and secretly laughed at herself. Since she was going to leave anyway, what was she expecting? Her future belonged only to her and the child in her belly. Tyler, just stay in the past. 2. Dragging her tired body home. Florence walked into the house and saw her parents, Tyler, and her sister sitting at the table having breakfast. Everyone was startled when they saw Florence enter. Obviously, they had forgotten that she had worked the night shift and was both tired and hungry. Georgia, sitting in a wheelchair, was the first to speak. It's all my fault for being so hungry. I started eating before my sister came back. I hope Florence doesn't mind. Because of a car accident on her performance tour abroad, the whole family had to take care of Georgia's emotions. Of course not, it's just a meal. How could a meal compare to the hurt she had suffered all these years? She didn't miss the guilty look in Tyler's eyes. As if to make amends, Tyler quickly got up to serve her soup. Before it even reached her, Florence smelled a strong, fishy odor. Florence's mother smiled and said, "This is mutton soup that I've been simmering all night. It's specially for your sister to nourish her body." Florence's stomach churned immediately, and she rushed to the bathroom. Tyler's hand paused as he served the soup. Only then did he remember that Florence didn't eat mutton and couldn't stand the smell. "It's all my fault. I insisted on having mutton soup and made my sister feel uncomfortable." George's tone was affected. Florence's mother didn't glance at Florence, but only comforted her eldest daughter. "It's all my fault for spoiling you. It's just mutton soup. What's the big deal? I find it very fragrant. You're just unlucky. Look at you. You've been married for 3 years and still don't have a child." From behind the door, Florence heard every word her mother said. Her father was also joining in, and Tyler just listened without saying a word. Florence was used to such scenes, but her already broken heart still ached. Suppressing her emotions, she calmly said she had no appetite and went back to her room to rest. As soon as she closed the door, a harmonious atmosphere was restored outside. It was exactly the same as when she was a child at home. Florence used to think that when she grew up and had her own home, no one would think she was superfluous. But now it seemed like nothing had changed. The husband who claimed to protect her always had another woman in his heart. After a while, Tyler came into the room and brought Florence a bowl of white porridge. "Eat a little, or your body won't be able to take it." Thinking of the child in her belly, Florence still took the porridge and drank it. Tyler stayed with her after she finished the porridge, but he still sat there, his hands nowhere to put, extremely uneasy. "If you have something to say, just say it." Florence put down the bowl and glanced at him. Tyler then opened his mouth. "George's room is a bit small now, and it's also on the shady side. I want her to stay in our room these days. It will also help her recover." Florence was stunned by his request for a second. "What about me? Where do I sleep?" "We'll just make do at the unit. Georgia won't be staying for too long." Florence smiled bitterly. This was her good husband, who always considered others, but never thought of his wife. Today Georgia wanted her bedroom, and tomorrow she would probably want her husband. Tyler wanted to say something else, but Florence interrupted him. She said very calmly without a ripple, "Okay, I agree. I'll pack up the room right away." Tyler didn't expect Florence to agree so quickly. In the past, whenever it involved his sister, the two of them would argue for a long time. Today's Florence seemed very different from before. Although he was puzzled, Tyler didn't ask any more questions. He closed the door and left, as if afraid that Florence would change her mind. Florence looked at the bedroom where the two of them had lived for 3 years, and her nose turned sour. The carefully decorated room and the carefully maintained marriage were ultimately sand that she couldn't hold in her fingertips. Neither the bedroom nor Tyler. She didn't want any of it anymore. 3. The dean's transfer order arrived soon. Florence clutched the paper tightly carefully noting the departure date. 7 days from now. 7 days, that was enough. Enough time for her to pack her things and completely separate herself from Tyler. It wasn't until sunset that she had finished packing everything. The part related to Tyler, she had packed into 3 large boxes. There was the scarf she had given Tyler, the sugar figurines she had made for them, and the tie she had carefully selected for him, which he had thrown in a corner and never worn. There were also some small gifts that Tyler had given her perfunctorily, such as the bracelet she had once treasured. Now it lay lonely in the box, and Florence planned to discard it completely. As for the things that truly belonged to her, there were very few, and they only filled 1 box. The thing Florence was most reluctant to leave behind on her trip south was Mimi, the stray cat she had adopted. She had raised the lazy tricolor cat for 3 years and had grown attached to it when her old wound recurred, and she was in excruciating pain. While Tyler was accompanying Georgia to the amusement park, when she was so nauseous from pregnancy that she just wanted a cup of hot water, but Tyler was accompanying Georgia for rehabilitation. Mimi had been with her through it all. She had to take Mimi with her this time to the south. Just as Florence was thinking about asking someone how to transport pets, she turned around and saw Georgia sitting in her wheelchair at her door, with a meaningful smile on her face. "Are these all gifts from Tyler? None of your business." Florence didn't want to get entangled with her, but she was blocked by the wheelchair. Georgia sneered. "You don't think Tyler really loves you, do you? He just feels sorry for you." Georgia never showed this kind of spiteful face in front of her parents and Tyler. Only Florence had seen this side of her. She picked up the bracelet from the box that Florence was about to discard and showed the bracelet on her own arm. "In Tyler's eyes, you're just a substitute. Everything he gave you is what I like. Do you think when he looks at these things, he'll think of who?" Florence had already expected these things. Otherwise, she wouldn't have chosen to discard everything about Tyler. It's none of my business who he's thinking of. She no longer wanted to get entangled with the 2 of them. She just wanted to leave with the child quietly. But Georgia obviously didn't intend to let her go so easily. A hint of malice flashed in her eyes. "Then let me show you who he really cares about." After saying that, Georgia leaned forward and fell directly from the wheelchair, crying out in pain. "Sister, I know I shouldn't stay in your room, but you can't push me." Florence's parents heard the noise and ran in immediately. Seeing their eldest daughter sitting on the ground crying, Florence's father slapped Florence without a second thought. "You crazy woman, your sister is still injured. How could you push your sister?" Florence's mother was even more heartbroken as she looked at her eldest daughter, glaring at Florence with resentment. "How could I have raised such a disgusting thing as you?" Even though she had always been the unfavored one since she was a child, Florence couldn't help but feel heartbroken, and tears immediately fell from her eyes. "I didn't push her." 4. Georgia had used this same trick countless times since she was a child, and every time, her parents would unconditionally believe Georgia and stand by her side. Florence had doubted herself countless times. It wasn't until later that she discovered that after her parents had given birth to her sister, they had wanted a son to complete their good word. But when they found out it was a daughter, they were disappointed. Plus, Georgia was afraid that her parents would love her less if they had a younger sister, so she always slandered her sister in front of her parents. Over time, Florence's parents, who had originally wanted a son, favored their eldest daughter even more. Tyler happened to come back from outside and saw Georgia fall to the ground. He quickly went to pick her up and put her back in the wheelchair. He didn't notice his wife with her cheeks swollen. Instead, Georgia, with teary eyes, leaned against him and cried, "Tyler, my leg hurts so much." Tyler looked at the bruise on her leg with a heart full of pain. "How did this happen?" Florence's mother immediately pointed her finger at Florence and scolded, "Isn't it all because of this little bitch? She's the one who pushed Georgia." Tyler finally noticed his wife, who was crying with her face covered. In all their years of marriage, he had never seen Florence cry. Tyler was suddenly stunned, and his heart inexplicably ached. He subconsciously wanted to wipe away Florence's tears, but she dodged him. With a sudden sense of unease, he defended Florence for the rare time, and he looked at Florence's mother and asked, "Mom, Is there some kind of misunderstanding? Florence's father interjected. Misunderstanding? If it weren't for her, could Georgia have fallen to the ground on her own? It's not my sister's fault. I made my sister angry. Georgia also lowered her head and cried pitifully. Florence looked at the family of three indifferently, and finally her gaze stopped on Tyler. As if using all her strength, she asked indifferently, "Do you think I pushed her?" Tyler was very confused. Just as he was about to say something, he heard Georgia cry, covering her face. "I just wore this bracelet, and my sister misunderstood me for taking her things. But this one is really not my sister's, hers is here." Tyler saw the bracelet on the ground that was exactly the same as Georgia's, and immediately frowned. At that moment, images of Florence making unreasonable demands of him over trivial matters came to his mind. She must have pushed Georgia again because of this trivial matter of the bracelet. "Apologize." He looked at Florence coldly, his eyes full of disappointment. At that moment, Florence suddenly laughed. See, this man was still the same as always, and would never stand by her side. Florence felt that their 3-year marriage was just a joke. She said nothing, picked up Mimi on the ground, and walked straight out of the door, bypassing everyone. Behind her, she could still hear her sister's whiny cry of pain. "Tyler, will my leg injury get worse?" Tyler looked blankly at Florence's back, then at Georgia, with a complex look in his eyes. But in the end, he still softly comforted the person in front of him. "No, I'll re-bandage it for you." Florence's mother hurried to find some gauze, and before leaving, she couldn't help but add to Florence's back, "If anything happens to Georgia, I won't let you go." As she walked out of the house, the noise grew quieter. It was cold outside, and Florence was alone on the vast street. The surging memories and the darkness of the night enveloped her, making it hard for her to breathe. She couldn't hear anything. She could only feel the burning pain on her face, and her heart was as cold as a deep pool. It turned out that Tyler's promise to treat her well and protect her was just a joke. She couldn't bear Tyler's repayment. She had to leave this place that made her so uncomfortable. Florence curled up in a corner and felt something warm licking her cheek. She burst into tears and held Mimi in her arms. "Mimi, you're all I have." That night, Florence didn't stay at home. She went directly to the hospital with her luggage. When the dean saw her like this, he didn't ask any more questions and found a place for Florence to rest. In the middle of the night, the hospital suddenly became a mess. Someone had a car accident and needed emergency surgery, but there weren't enough surgeons on duty in the middle of the night, and Tyler was missing a deputy. Someone stood up and said, "Let Dr. Florence do it. She used to be a surgeon too." Florence was stunned for a second. She didn't want to face Tyler after the unpleasant incident in the daytime. But in order to save the patient, she didn't hesitate and said, "I'm willing to go to the operating table." Although she hadn't been in the operating room for a long time, she could do it as an assistant, without being the main surgeon. But Tyler avoided her gaze, hesitated for a moment and gritted his teeth. "Let the intern come with me." Then he turned and strode towards the operating room without looking back. "She hasn't been in the operating room for too long. We can't afford to make any mistakes with this surgery." Florence was stunned in place. Hearing him talking to the team, a chill ran down her spine. It turned out that in Tyler's eyes, she was already a useless person. But she had once been as good as him, even a better chief surgeon. In the end, Tyler had never seen her worth. That night, heavy snow fell, covering the entire J City in a layer of silver. The surgery ended in the early morning, and although it took a long time, the final result was very successful. Everyone in the hospital applauded for Tyler. The doctor who came out of the operating room, besides fatigue, also had an unconcealable pride on his face. Once upon a time, Florence was also the doctor who could snatch people back from the hands of death on the operating table. Such glory had been too far away from her. Florence quickly adjusted her emotions and continued to stand her last few shifts. 5. Countdown, 5 days. Florence learned from others that Tyler was going to be promoted to chief physician. "Florence, you really married a good husband. He's young and promising, and he doesn't look at the other women in the hospital. He's so deep and dedicated." "Yeah, Dr. Tyler is probably the youngest director in our hospital." Listening to these words, Florence couldn't smile at all. She had to hear about her husband's promotion from others. What a meaningless wife she was. Florence just nodded silently. During the day, she had already arranged to take Mimi to the south. There were only 2 days left, and her luggage was still at the hospital. She couldn't leave Mimi at home, so she decided to go back home and pick up the cat. The ice and snow had melted on the way back, and the road was cold and crowded. Since Georgia returned, Tyler had never thought of picking her up from work. Even in such weather, he didn't say a word to her. When Florence arrived at her doorstep, her shoes and socks were damp, and her hands were freezing cold. She took out her key and was about to open the door, but found that the lock couldn't be opened no matter how hard she tried. Florence looked down and found that the door had a brand new lock. Her heart ached involuntarily. Before she even left, they had eagerly changed the lock. Worried that Mimi would be hungry at home, she called out for a long time from the first-floor window. Usually, Mimi would run over after a couple of calls, but today, she called for more than 10 minutes, and Mimi didn't appear. Florence's heart was pounding, and she had a bad feeling. She didn't know how long she waited at the door before Tyler came back. The headlights of the car were blinding, and 4 people walked out of the warm car, chatting and laughing. The movie today was really good. Thanks to Tyler for the movie tickets. Mom, we're all family, so there's no need to say thank you. Florence had been standing for so long that her legs were a little stiff. Listening to their family chatting happily, she felt like an outsider. Tyler saw Florence standing at the door, paused for a second, his expression unnatural, and quickly handed the wheelchair to Florence's mother, running towards her. "Why are you standing here? It's so cold." So he knew it was cold too. Florence dodged his outstretched hand, her lips pale. "The lock has been changed." Florence's father came over and gave Tyler a new key. "I changed the lock. The old one was broken, and Georgia didn't have a key, so it was inconvenient to go out." Tyler didn't know about this, but he felt a sudden tightness in his heart when he saw Florence's haggard appearance. He scolded his father. "Dad, you should have told us if you were going to change the lock." Florence's mother helped Georgia walk slowly behind. "Oh dear, be careful, darling." "Tyler, this is your fault. Dad only changed the lock because he saw that it was inconvenient for me to go out. You blame Tyler." Georgia tugged at Tyler's sleeve. "Tyler, what are you saying? How could I blame you?" Florence didn't want to see her hypocritical face, so she strode forward quickly. She just wanted to see Mimi as soon as possible. But the moment she opened the door, she didn't hear Mimi's familiar meow. Turning on the light, the place where the cat bed and food bowl used to be was empty. Florence panicked immediately, grabbed Tyler's clothes, and asked urgently, "Where's Mimi? Where's Mimi?" Florence's mother helped Georgia sit down and carefully cleaned the snow off her. "You mean that vicious fat cat? It was always blocking the door, such a waste of food." Florence's eyes were red, and she walked towards her mother in disbelief. "So what? What did you do to my cat?" Tyler saw Florence's loss of control and quickly tried to pull her, but he was a step too late. 6. Florence was on the verge of a breakdown. Her eyes were red, and she was hysterical, as fragile as if she would shatter at any moment. Florence's mother ignored her pain and simply scolded her. "What's your attitude? Talking to your mother like that over a cat? So what if I threw it away? Don't you know your sister is allergic to cat hair? I think you did it on purpose." Florence held back her tears and looked out at the boundless snow, and without hesitation she rushed out. For some reason, Tyler felt a pang of heartache as he looked at his wife, who was full of brokenness, and he immediately followed her. He grabbed Florence. "It's snowing again outside. Where are you going alone?" Florence shook off his hand. "Don't bother me. I just want my Mimi." "It's just a cat. It was a stray cat anyway, so what if it's lost?" Florence looked at the man in front of her, her eyes filled with astonishment and disappointment, and the light in her eyes gradually dimmed. Just lost. A cat meant so little to him. Everything she cared about meant so little to him. It was something that could be ignored and easily discarded. Florence just looked at him calmly, slowly broke free from his restraint, and turned to walk into the new snow without looking back. At that moment, Tyler felt a little panicked. Watching Florence run further and further away in the snow, he felt like something important was gradually slipping away with Florence. He had just taken a step to chase after her when he heard Florence's father calling him from behind. "Tyler, Georgia won't take this medicine, come in and help me. That stupid girl won't go far, don't worry about her." Tyler retreated in the end. On that snowy night, no one cared whether Florence was cold or not. She walked alone in the snow for a long time, and she didn't see any trace of Mimi in many of the places she loved to go. Standing alone in the vast snowy night, she was almost frozen by the biting cold. She knew that the warm little angel would not come back. Her only connection to this city was gone too. When she returned to the hospital, it was still dark. Nurse Hazel found Florence standing outside. Florence fainted as soon as she entered the hospital. When she woke up again, it was the next day, and only Nurse Hazel was by her side. Hazel was relieved to see Florence finally awake. "You scared me to death walking around in this freezing weather. You're not alone now. You have a child in your belly. You have to be careful." Hazel brought a bowl of hot porridge to her. Florence felt blurry, and she thought of Mimi she could never find again, and her eyes couldn't help but feel sore. Even the sweet porridge tasted salty. Hazel didn't know how to comfort her seeing her like this, so she could only persuade her not to be so sad for the sake of the child. "Dr. Tyler is really something. How could he let you walk around in the freezing cold alone?" Florence didn't respond to the nurse. She looked out the window at the heavy snow, and her heart was as cold as the weather. Seeing Florence's pale appearance, the nurse hoped she could rest a little more, but Florence refused. She wanted to stand her last shift, and she also wanted to wait for Tyler to come and sign the divorce agreement. She put the divorce agreement among a pile of medical records that needed to be signed and waited quietly for Tyler to arrive. Until it was time for work, Tyler came in looking tired. He originally wanted to blame Florence for being so unreasonable. Why couldn't a family just talk things out? But when he saw Florence's pale cheeks, he felt a little heartache. "Did you catch a cold last night? I told you not to go out. Are you running a fever?" Seeing Tyler's hand about to touch her forehead, Florence slightly turned her head to avoid it. "I'm fine." Florence didn't even look at him and lowered her head to look at the roster. "Dr. Tyler, don't you have a surgery consultation at 8 o'clock? The patients should be the priority." Tyler's hand was left hanging in the air. Looking at Florence's expressionless face, he felt something start to change in his heart. Florence would never make a scene with him in public. But since her family came, Florence seemed to have become a different person. Tyler wanted to have a good talk with her, but Florence pushed the medical records over expressionlessly. "There are a few medical records here that need your signature. Please sign them as soon as possible so I can file them." Tyler wanted to say something else, but a colleague ran over. "Dr. Tyler, there's a surgery consultation at 8 o'clock. He had to sign quickly and then go to the meeting. He didn't notice that when he signed the divorce agreement, Florence's palms were sweating. Looking at the man's receding back, Florence showed a relieved smile, and tears couldn't help but fall on the big words divorce agreement. She was finally free. 7. Day 4 of the countdown. Florence hadn't expected to see Georgia at the hospital. Just before shift change, there was a commotion at the hospital entrance. "Make way. Let me through." Florence looked up and saw Tyler rushing and carrying Georgia. Georgia clung tightly to Tyler, tears streaming down her face. "Doctor, where's the doctor? Is the orthopedic doctor here?" As the doctor on duty, Florence stepped forward to check. "Where are you hurt?" But as soon as Georgia saw her, she buried her head deeper into Tyler's arms and sobbed quietly, refusing to say another word. Seeing her like this, Tyler didn't care about anything else and just kept whispering soothing words. Florence had no choice but to examine her wound. But before her hand touched Georgia's foot, Georgia started crying loudly. "Tyler, it hurts so much. My sister touched me and it hurts so much." As soon as Tyler heard Georgia cry out in pain, he immediately reached out and pushed Florence aside. He only cared about Georgia in front of him and didn't notice that his wife had stumbled and fallen. Florence immediately protected her belly, but still felt a sharp pain coming from her abdomen. She felt the little life inside her slipping away. Tyler, save the baby. She was in so much pain that she couldn't speak, and her voice trembled. But everyone was gathered around Georgia, and no one heard her cry for help. She watched helplessly as Tyler carried Georgia to the operating table, and a group of people pushed her in for an examination. Florence's vision blurred until her colleagues discovered the blood on her and rushed her to the operating table. "I'm sorry, but we lost the baby." Those were the first words Florence heard when she woke up. She stared blankly at the ceiling, not daring to touch her flat abdomen. She could no longer feel her child. "I'm sorry, baby, Mommy didn't protect you." Tears soaked the pillow. She had given up everything. She was about to leave. She couldn't protect her home, her husband, her cat, and now she couldn't even protect her child. If Tyler hadn't pushed her and caused her to fall, she wouldn't have lost her child. Maybe the child didn't want to be born into such a family. She lay alone in the hospital bed, her heart cold, but she still asked her colleague to keep the loss of her child a secret. Nurse Hazel held Florence's hand tightly, feeling sorry for the strong girl. For 3 days, Florence hung up every call Tyler made. She didn't want anything to do with that man anymore. On the last day of the countdown, she packed her bags, went through the discharge procedures, and said goodbye to everyone. And then she asked someone to send the divorce agreement to Tyler. Nurse Hazel hugged her with tears in her eyes, feeling very reluctant. Before she left, she couldn't help but ask, "Aren't you going to attend Tyler's promotion banquet today?" In her heart, Florence and Tyler were like a perfect couple, and she couldn't understand how they had come to this point. Florence smiled lightly. "It won't affect his promotion if I don't go." The nurse didn't know what else to say. Florence had made up her mind to leave Tyler. She had truly had enough disappointment. In the 3 hours before going to the station, Florence had finished all the procedures and said goodbye to all her colleagues and friends. Because she missed Mimi so much, and there was still some time left, she decided to go back one more time to see if there was a miracle, if she could see Mimi again. But before she entered the door, she heard the two people inside talking. "Tyler, I'll accompany you to the promotion banquet tonight. Will my sister be unhappy?" Georgia was wearing a custom-made dress, her eyes filled with joy. The man paused for a moment and comforted her. "No, she won't. I've called her for 3 days, but she hasn't returned a single call. It's her own fault if she misses this moment in the spotlight. No one can blame anyone. Besides, this evening gown is too revealing, and she has such an ugly scar on her arm. It won't look good on her. If she hadn't blocked that knife for me at that time, maybe." He didn't finish his sentence, but Florence outside the door felt her heart ache, and her whole body staggered. She covered her mouth tightly to prevent herself from crying out. Everyone could dislike her scar and laugh at her, except for Tyler. It was a scar she got while saving Tyler. It was a lifelong pain in Florence's heart, but now that man thought her sacrifice was not worth it, and it had even become an obstacle in his love life. For 3 years, Florence had never regretted saving Tyler, but at that moment she truly regretted it. Tyler didn't deserve her selfless act. At that moment, her determination to leave the South became unwavering. She turned around and resolutely walked into the wind and snow, boarding the train south. From then on, she and Tyler went their separate ways, never to see each other again. 8. The heavy snowfall made all of J City seem exceptionally desolate. For some reason, as Tyler looked out at the bleak scene, he felt a dull ache in his heart, as if it had been clenched. He politely declined Georgia's offer to accompany him to the banquet. He always felt more at ease when Florence was by his side. In fact, he had been looking for a nursing home for Georgia all this time. Once he found a suitable place, he planned to take advantage of the banquet to have a good talk with Florence. "I'm going to the hospital first. You don't have to accompany me tonight. I'll ask Florence to go with me." With that, he left the house in a hurry and headed towards the hospital, failing to notice the malicious resentment on George's face. "Florence, Tyler is mine and mine alone. You don't deserve him." George's nails dug into her flesh. The scene she had created 3 days ago was actually because her leg had recovered well, and she felt pain. For the past 3 days, She had gone to great lengths to keep Tyler by her side and accompany her in her rehabilitation, hoping to accompany Tyler to the promotion banquet in 3 days. But just when she was about to succeed, Tyler wanted to find Florence. She wished Florence would just disappear and never come back. Tyler arrived at the hospital and wanted to find Florence, but the hospital was unusually busy today, which made Tyler very anxious. He wanted to finish his work quickly and see Florence. For some reason, he missed Florence especially today, but when he finished his work in the department, it was already very late, and he was called to an emergency meeting. The patient's condition was very bad, with damage to the spleen, and there was only a 50% chance of successful surgery. Just as everyone was silent, someone said, "It would be great if Dr. Florence hadn't injured her hand. She's the most professional in this area." Tyler also remembered Florence's appearance on the operating table a few years ago. Confident and bright, she was radiant. The day Florence joined the hospital, she was determined to become an excellent surgeon and save lives. It was just that her dream had been halted 3 years ago. It was not that he didn't feel guilty, but with the advancement of medical technology, Florence's arm would definitely be cured, and she could return to the operating table. No matter how long it took, he would be by Florence's side. Thinking about this, Tyler felt that it was incredibly fortunate to have someone to share life's journey with. As soon as the meeting ended, he couldn't wait to find Florence. He thought about how he would coax her along the way, how to clear up the misunderstandings of these days. When Georgia went to the nursing home, no one else would disturb their home. Everything he had belonged to Florence, and no one could take it away from her. But when he went around the nursing station in the emergency department, he couldn't find Florence. Tyler grabbed a young nurse and asked, "Where's Dr. Florence?" The new nurse shook her head. "There's no doctor named Florence in the emergency department." Tyler had to go to the rest area to find her. Florence hadn't been home for the past few days, so she must be in the hospital's rest area. Thinking of Florence's charming face, he quickened his pace, eager to see his wife. But when he reached the rest area, he was stunned for a moment. This place was on the shady side of the hospital, dark and damp, and with the cold winter in J City, it felt cold everywhere. Tyler had never set foot in this place before. He had always been a top surgeon, and wherever he went, people would put him on a pedestal. The resting place he used was the best and most luxurious in the entire hospital. He never thought that Florence's resting area would be so simple. For a moment, guilt reached its peak. Yes, 3 years ago, Florence had been slashed and had been demoted from a frontline surgeon to a second-line one. So naturally her conditions would not be as good. Yet, she had never complained for 3 years. Thinking about how he had made her stay in such a place every night they had argued, Tyler felt as if his heart had been clutched. Damn it! He wanted to slap himself. The rest area was not big, and there weren't many smart spaces. Tyler knocked on every door, but the people who opened the door were not Florence. "I think there was a doctor living here a few days ago, but she left this morning." Left. These 2 words struck a nerve in Tyler. Where could Florence go alone? She must have gone home if she left this morning. No matter how they argued, she would still go home. Florence was all he had in J City. Tyler thanked the nurse hurriedly and rushed towards home. He thought that this time he would tell Florence everything clearly, and she would never leave him again. It was snowing heavily outside again, just like the night Florence left home to find the cat. Tyler hurried towards home, and he didn't even respond when people greeted him. He felt like he would miss something very important if he was a moment late. 9. When Tyler opened the door to his house, he was immediately hit with the smell of mutton. Florence's parents urged him to come over for dinner. He clearly remembered telling them the last time not to cook mutton. Tyler looked around, but couldn't find Florence. The house felt empty, missing many of the small things that had been there before. Just as Tyler was about to ask, Georgia immediately wrapped herself around him. "Tyler, was the banquet over so quickly? Come and rest for a while, you must be tired." Tyler looked at the neatly arranged mutton on the table and frowned. "Didn't I say that Florence doesn't eat mutton?" This was the first time Tyler had spoken to them in such a cold tone. Florence's mother immediately started to deflect. "What's the big deal? There are other dishes, aren't there? Besides, she's not coming back anyway. Hasn't she been gone for several days? Florence's father also expressed some dissatisfaction. How can you not eat hot pot in such weather? For the sake of a girl, you're so precious. Tyler saw the favoritism of Florence's parents, but he didn't say much because of George's leg injury. But that didn't mean they could hurt his wife without consequences. Tyler didn't touch the food and looked at Florence's parents with a suppressed temper. I have something else to tell you too. Georgia tried to please him. Tyler, just say it, we're family. I've found a nursing home for Georgia where she can get treatment for her leg injury, and family members can accompany her. I'll take you there to see it in a few days. The cup in Georgia's hand immediately fell to the ground, and she looked at Tyler in disbelief. Florence's mother also immediately stood up for her daughter. You're saying we're redundant? They say that a son-in-law is half a son, but now it seems like you don't even want us in the house. Faced with their accusations, Tyler finally saw through this family's true colors. At that moment, he empathized with Florence's helplessness and despair. And how long had she endured this? Tyler couldn't hear the crying and accusations around him. He looked at the home he shared with Florence, which had been completely changed by their arrival. Because Georgia was allergic to pollen, all the flowers that Florence had carefully planted had been uprooted. Because Georgia needed to recuperate, he had given up his master bedroom with his wife. How much more did he need to do to satisfy them? Tyler didn't want to listen to them anymore. He just wanted to find Florence and give her a big hug. Tyler ignored the three of them, went to the bedroom to get his dress clothes, and planned to go out and continue looking for Florence. But his dress clothes had been cut to pieces and were completely unwearable. He sighed silently, finally put down the clothes, and turned to leave when he saw a bottle of folic acid in the corner. So Florence had been secretly trying to conceive? The thought of having a child with Florence made Tyler feel warm and excited. He couldn't wait to find Florence and tell her about his feelings. But just as he was about to reach the door, he saw an envelope on the cabinet. He recognized it as a hospital envelope. Tyler was puzzled. Who would send him a letter from the hospital? He opened the envelope and was stunned by what he saw. Inside was a divorce agreement. 10. Tyler held the divorce agreement with his name on it, his hands trembling. How could this be? He hadn't agreed to it. How could they be getting a divorce? Tyler looked at his own signature, and his vision blurred. Why? What had he done to make her leave without a word, without even giving him a chance to explain? Suddenly, Tyler thought of someone who must know what had happened to Florence. Tyler braved the heavy snow and ran to the hospital, completely oblivious to Georgia's calls from behind. Whenever Georgia asked for something, he would always be there for her immediately. After all, she was his first love, the first person to make his heart flutter. But since she had left him to study abroad, and Florence had appeared in his life like a rescuing angel, when the violent family members rushed at him with knives, she had unhesitatingly blocked the knife for him. And then for 3 years, she had carefully nurtured their little home, giving him worldly warmth. Over the past 3 years, images of Florence flashed through his mind. He realized that Florence had occupied all of his heart. Now, his heart was full of nothing but Florence. Walking in the cold wind and snow, Tyler's shoes and socks were soaked. With every step he took, he could feel the helplessness, panic, and coldness that Florence must have felt that snowy night. He was also searching for someone who would never return in the endless night and boundless snow. As soon as he entered the hospital, he rushed to the nurse's station. His colleagues had never seen Dr. Tyler so disheveled. He asked anxiously, "Where's the head nurse? Where's Nurse Hazel?" Hazel had a good relationship with Florence, and she must know where Florence was. The young nurses were startled by his appearance and explained that the head nurse was on leave today. Tyler immediately and desperately knocked on the head nurse's door. It had snowed heavily in J City that day, and there were very few people on the streets. Tyler wandered the streets searching. No matter how difficult it was, he had to find Florence. He couldn't lose Florence. His hands were red from the cold, but he still clutched the divorce agreement tightly. It was as if as long as he didn't let go, there would still be hope. Tyler broke into Nurse Hazel's house in the heavy snow. The whole street was quiet, with every house brightly lit, and everyone was curled up in their warm homes enjoying the winter. But where was Florence? Hazel, wearing a coat, came out of the house. When she saw Tyler, her expression turned sour. Florence had just left, and she was still upset. Seeing the man who had made Florence so cold, she was naturally angry. Nurse Hazel was about to close the door, but Tyler stopped her. The nurse couldn't just shut the door. She also saw Tyler's hands, which were red from the cold. Dr. Tyler, why are you here so late at night instead of attending your promotion banquet? Florence, my wife, where did she go? He held up the divorce agreement and stared at the nurse. You must know where she went, right? You're her best friend. Looking at Tyler now, the nurse felt a sense of sadness. He clearly loved Florence. Why hadn't he shown his love earlier? Dr. Tyler, Florence left J City for the South today. South. Tyler's expression froze like the icy snow. The hope he had been clinging to shattered in that moment. He had spent the whole night looking for her, but she was already far away. 11. How could she go south without telling me? The nurse sighed. Florence is your wife, but you don't seem to know her at all. If you had cared a little more about her, she wouldn't have left so decisively. The nurse paused and tears fell again. Florence didn't deserve this, she even lost the baby. At the mention of the child, Tyler was rooted to the spot, unable to move. His eyes widened, and his face was filled with disbelief. Florence and he had a child. They actually had a child. So that folic acid wasn't for her to prepare for pregnancy. She was really pregnant. Tyler was so excited that he almost grabbed the nurse's hand. When did you find out about the baby? How could it be gone? Tyler tried to recall what had happened in the past few months. It seemed that since Georgia had returned, he had devoted all his attention to Georgia and hadn't spoken to Florence properly. So when Florence found out she was pregnant, she never told him. Looking at Tyler's appearance, the nurse suddenly understood why Florence had to leave. Whether a man loves you or not can be seen in where he spends his time. Obviously, Tyler hadn't spent a minute more on Florence, otherwise he wouldn't know anything. This was his wife after all. Even if you didn't know Florence was pregnant, you should have cared about her when she fell down, the nurse said. If you hadn't pushed Florence away for another woman, she wouldn't have lost the baby. The fetal heartbeat was perfectly normal the day before. As a mother herself, the nurse couldn't help but cry when she thought of the pain of losing a child. Tyler was also lost in thought. At the emergency room that day, he had only noticed Georgia crying and hadn't paid any attention to Florence. As soon as Georgia cried, he pushed Florence aside and rushed to examine Georgia, completely oblivious to Florence who had fallen. He didn't even know that his push had caused Florence to lose her child, and him to lose his child with Florence. Florence called out to you for help that day, but you only had eyes for others. How desperate must she have felt? Nurse Hazel couldn't help but accuse. Tyler stood there, struck like lightning. Florence had reached out to him and called for him to save their child. Why hadn't he heard it? Why couldn't he have been more rational? Why couldn't he have looked at her one more time? They had always wanted a child together, but they hadn't succeeded in these years. Now that he finally had what he wanted, he had destroyed the life of their child. If he had paid more attention to Florence and cared for her more, would everything have been different? Tyler walked alone on the snowy road, the cold snow beneath his feet and the howling wind in his ears. But he seemed to feel nothing, his heart filled only with thoughts of Florence and their lost child. South. He had heard that the hospital in the new economic zone needed staff, so Florence must have gone there. He had to find Florence back. He had to make things right with his wife. He had to remarry Florence. Tyler looked at the divorce agreement in his hand. It was invalid. They would definitely be able to reconcile, and they would have a lovely child. The child would definitely look like Florence. Thinking of this, he rushed to the hospital and waited at the dean's office door. As soon as the dean arrived, he grabbed the dean's arm, his beard disheveled. "Dean, I demand that you immediately revoke Florence's transfer order. She can't go to the branch hospital." The dean looked at Tyler, who was covered in snow and looked so tired and dejected, and shook his head. "Do you think transfer orders can be revoked at will? She's already left, and there's no way to bring her back." "But she didn't tell me anything about going south. Doesn't a transfer require the family's consent?" I didn't know anything about it. 12. The dean took off his glasses and looked at Tyler helplessly. Dr. Tyler, I've seen your divorce agreement with Dr. Florence. You are no longer married, so you can't be considered family. Going south to support the country is a contribution to the nation and a personal honor. The decision will not be changed just because of a few words from you. I hope you will think it over carefully. I'll give you a few days off. When Tyler didn't show up at the promotion ceremony, the dean knew something was wrong. Florence and Tyler were the two most outstanding doctors under him, and he had been very sorry about the medical dispute incident. Later, when he saw the two of them get married, he felt truly relieved. He never thought they would end up like this. The dean didn't want to see this situation more than anyone else. But it was also a good choice for Florence to pursue a new life in a new environment. Just as the dean was about to ask him to leave, he heard Tyler say, "I'm willing to go to the branch hospital in the south to support the country's construction." The dean turned around immediately, looking at him with disappointment. "This project is already over, and besides, you've just been promoted. Don't always think about these things." Without the dean's approval, Tyler sat alone in the hospital corridor. Although he had been here for a long time, for the first time, he felt so cold. He lowered his head and stared blankly at the floor, recalling bits and pieces of his life with Florence. He remembered the vows he had made to Florence. Those words had shattered like bubbles after Georgia returned. He was a negligent husband who hadn't even done the basic thing of taking care of his wife. Tyler grabbed his hair and regretted everything he had done, until he heard footsteps approaching. "Excuse me, are you Dr. Tyler?" Tyler nodded, but didn't look up. The person continued, "You're Dr. Florence's husband, right?" It wasn't until he heard Florence's name that Tyler looked up. "Yes, what is it?" "Dr. Florence left in a hurry and didn't take her ultrasound reports. Since you're her husband, please take them. Please take care of yourself." The doctor left after saying that. Tyler took the ultrasound report and the report on the loss of the baby, and his heart ached. Looking at the dot on the ultrasound, he realized that it was their child. It was his child. Tyler couldn't help but sob loudly. People passing by couldn't help but look at him. After crying for a while, he gradually regained his composure. Florence's departure was not without reason. Besides his negligence as a husband, he also wanted to find out what Florence's family had done to her. Tyler arrived at his doorstep, but didn't want to open the door, because the house no longer felt like home without Florence. Georgia came over with a smile, seeing him return. She carefully served him soup and food. "I've asked my parents to move out. From now on, it's just the two of us. I know my sister has left, and I'll be here for you." Georgia looked forward to the future with a hopeful expression. "We'll be just like we were when we were young. I'll always be with you. This will be our home." Tyler slammed the bowl on the ground and shouted at her, "This is my home with Florence." 13. Georgia flinched back, startled by Tyler's anger. She had never seen him so furious before. She curled up into a ball, continuing to look at Tyler with her usual pitiful expression. But Tyler didn't give her a second glance as he usually would. He walked towards their bedroom, their shared sanctuary. The entire house should belong to Florence, not to anyone else. But everything looked so strange to Tyler. Their bedroom had changed. There were no more of Florence's medical books casually placed on the bookshelf. The soothing scent of incense by the bedside had been replaced by something else. It wasn't Florence's scent. Most importantly, the wedding photo that had hung in the center of their headboard was gone. In its place was an art photo of Georgia. Since Florence had left home, Tyler hadn't stepped into this room. He didn't know their bedroom had been changed so drastically. He had told Florence not to worry about such details. But in the end, he was the one who cared the most about these trivial matters. Tyler turned to Georgia abruptly, his voice hoarse and filled with rage. "Where are my wife's things?" He didn't call Florence by her name. This was the first time he had addressed her as my wife in front of Georgia. Only after Florence had completely left him, and when she no longer needed such a title, did he call her his wife. Georgia cried and threw herself into Tyler's arms. "Tyler, please don't be like this. You're scaring me. My sister is gone, but you still have me. I'll always be with you." Tyler pried her fingers apart and pushed Georgia away. "You can never replace Florence in my heart," he said, each word heavy. He turned and left, ignoring Georgia's cries. Georgia grabbed the railing tightly and cursed. "Florence, what right do you have? You're already gone, so Tyler should be mine." For the next few days, Tyler was a mess. The dean didn't dare to give him his job back. He didn't dare go home. Everything there reminded him of Florence. Florence had taken everything that belonged to her, leaving nothing behind. In a corner of the building, Tyler found the only thing left of Florence, Mimi's toy. He realized that she had come back on the day of his promotion party, but he hadn't been there to meet her. He drank heavily every day. The once brilliant surgeon was now a drunkard. Whenever he was sober, he would think of the child he had lost. In his dreams, the child would cry and ask him for an explanation. The little hand would grab his and say how cold and scared it was. Tyler walked the streets lost and alone. He had lost everything he loved. 14. Tyler was tormented by his inner demons night after night. One day, drunk as usual, he saw a long-haired woman feeding a cat at his doorstep. The scene was so similar to Florence's. No one in this neighborhood liked cats except Florence, and no one would feed them. Tyler rubbed his eyes and stumbled over, hugging the woman. "Florence, is it you? It must be you." He held her tightly, firmly believing it was Florence. Tears welled up in his eyes as he gently coaxed. "Come home with me, will you? We'll be good to each other from now on. We'll never be apart again, and we'll have a child." He was so drunk he couldn't tell people apart, and once he had a hold of someone, he wouldn't let go. Tyler pulled the person into his arms and kissed them passionately, forgetting himself. The person in his arms didn't resist, even seeming to welcome his advances. Tyler, already intoxicated, didn't realize anything was amiss and responded even more forcefully, until they were both in bed, and Tyler's hand traveled upward. He habitually went to touch the scar on Florence's right forearm, but he felt nothing. The place where his fingertips touched was completely smooth and delicate. This person wasn't Florence at all. Tyler sobered up almost instantly and pushed the woman away, but the woman wrapped her arms around him again. Tyler angrily pushed her away. "Who are you?" He abruptly pulled open the curtains, and the outside light fell on Georgia. Tyler finally saw clearly that it was Georgia wearing Florence's clothes waiting for him at the door. Tyler immediately grabbed his clothes and got up to leave, but Georgia held him around the waist. "Tyler, you love me too, don't you? Otherwise, you wouldn't be so affectionate." Georgia held Tyler's hand tightly. "I know you must love me. We're the ones who love each other the most." Tyler looked at her coldly and explained, "I only touched you because you imitated Florence. You're not worthy of being compared to her. I only love her." Tyler turned his face away, not even bothering to look at her. "Give you 2 days to get out of here." After saying that, Tyler turned and left. As soon as he reached the door, Florence's parents came over and blocked the door, shouting loudly, "You ruined my daughter and you want to run away? My daughter was in bed with you for no reason. How can she face anyone after this? You still want to run? No way." Florence's mother's aggressiveness reminded Tyler of that afternoon, when Florence's mother had shouted that Florence had pushed Georgia, with the same disgusting voice. Now that he knew Florence's mother's favoritism, he realized that if he had been more decisive earlier, Florence wouldn't have suffered so much and wouldn't have left. He forcefully pushed them out and ignored Georgia's pleas. He even pushed her hard to the ground. Georgia's leg had just recovered and was very fragile. Now with a crack, it broke. But Tyler didn't care. He just sent her to a nursing home and gave the staff their strict instructions to take good care of Georgia. After doing all this, Tyler started frantically posting missing cat notices in the neighborhood. The lost cat was very important to Florence. Tyler thought that as long as the cat could come back, Florence would definitely come back too. Big and small poles, trees, and even shop entrances in the neighborhood were plastered with notices. People had only seen people looking for children or the elderly, but never anyone looking for a cat like this. Ignoring the puzzled looks of others, Tyler was determined to continue searching. It was with this kind of drive that he managed to get himself back on his feet, and he gradually returned to work. Until one day, Tyler received a phone call from abroad. At that moment, he was furious and full of regret. He slapped himself hard several times. 15. The man on the other end of the phone claimed to be Georgia's husband, but they had never gotten a marriage license. Georgia had gone abroad years ago, not for some so-called dance dream, but to be the mistress of a wealthy man. Later, Georgia was discovered by the wealthy man's original wife. The original wife was not a pushover and had people teach Georgia a lesson, which was why her leg was in its current state. It wasn't from a car accident on a performance tour as she claimed. Georgia returned home not to recuperate, but to find a sucker to continue to prey on. Tyler remembered that Florence's family had left the country overnight, without even telling Florence. She was still in school at the time and couldn't even afford tuition. And that family didn't leave her anything, they just left cruelly. Back then, Tyler had helped Florence when she was at her most destitute, and that was why Florence had always remembered him kindly. But for that little bit of kindness, she had paid a price she shouldn't have had to. Tyler laughed at himself for being so foolish, only now seeing the true colors of Florence's family. His long-awaited first love was nothing but a morally corrupt woman. Now that he knew everything, he was determined to make those who had hurt Florence pay the price. Tyler would regularly visit Georgia in the nursing home. He disguised himself well and didn't let Georgia see through him. Or perhaps Georgia was too arrogant, truly believing that the whole world should revolve around her. She still fantasized that Florence had left and would never return, and that Tyler would visit her regularly and soften his attitude, and they could be together again. She held Tyler's arm and said coquettishly, "When are we going to have a wedding?" Tyler hid the cruelty in his eyes and replied indifferently, "Soon, isn't it going to wait for your leg to recover? Have you invited everyone from home?" Georgia nodded with a smile. "Of course, I want the whole world to know who I'm marrying." Looking at her happy expression now, Tyler sneered inwardly, not knowing if she would still be able to smile on that day. He had prepared a rich gift for her. Tyler checked the surveillance footage as usual, and the content made him clench his fist again. After waiting so long, he finally got what he wanted. "Mom, did Florence really bleed a lot that day?" "Of course. As soon as I saw, I knew it was a miscarriage, but I held Tyler's hand and made him look at your leg, not allowing him to look back. You're really reliable." The laughter of the mother and daughter made him feel sick. So his child had been cruelly taken away by these people. He wouldn't let any of these people go. Soon, the day they had agreed to get engaged arrived. Florence's parents had invited all their relatives and friends, and the scene was noisy and lively. When he got married to Florence, none of Florence's family members were present. Since these people weren't Florence's relatives, they might as well come as spectators. Georgia waited in the banquet hall for a long time, going from full of anticipation to full of worry. Everyone couldn't reach Tyler, and when the time came, the guests started to get restless. Georgia discovered that not only had the groom not arrived, but Tyler's relatives and friends, and even his hospital colleagues had not come. Only then did Georgia really start to panic. "No, Tyler loves me so much, he will definitely come to marry me." Sure enough, at the last minute, the door opened and someone ran in. Georgia immediately smiled. She knew Tyler would come, but when she saw clearly who it was, her face turned pale as paper. "Scott, how did you get here? We're over. You get out of here." The guests below were also puzzled. Why is there a foreigner here? Scott's strength was not something Georgia could resist, and she cried out Tyler's name, but no one paid any attention to her. 16. Florence's parents tried to stop them, but it was useless. "You have to come back to my country with me today. You're the woman I bought, and you cost me money. As they say in your country, you're mine in life, and mine in death." While chaos ensued on the stage, recordings Tyler had collected over time began playing in the banquet hall. Florence deserved to lose her child. She's been a doormat since she was a child. "Do you remember when I tricked her into jumping into the river on a cold winter day? She's been sickly ever since." At that moment, everyone saw the true face of Florence's family. What a hypocrite. "It's a sin. I always thought Florence was such a good girl. How could she have been born into such a family?" Georgia said she was selected by a dance troupe abroad, but it turns out she was just someone's mistress? It's a disgrace to know people like them. Georgia was also slapped several times by Scott, and her entire face was swollen. She knelt on the ground and screamed hysterically, "I'm going to call the police! Call the police!" At that moment, Tyler slowly walked in from the door. "I've already called the police for you." Georgia's first reaction upon seeing Tyler was to rely on him and seek his help. But seeing his indifferent and hateful gaze, she immediately understood. "You did all this. Tyler, you're trying to ruin me." Tyler directly grabbed Georgia's hand as she swung at him. "Georgia, you brought this on yourself. How many things have you done to wrong Florence? This is your retribution." Georgia suddenly started laughing like a madman. She pointed at Tyler and cursed. "Do you think you're a good person? Without your constant indulgence, I wouldn't have really wanted to harm her. It's you never wanted to protect your wife. That's why I had the idea of replacing her. I've never been a good person, but are you a righteous gentleman? When Florence was around, I only had to beckon and you would come running. I didn't have to do anything, and all your eyes were on me. Now that Florence is gone, who are you putting on this act of deep affection for? You're her husband. You're the one who should protect her the most. But what have you done? You pushed her and caused her to lose her child. Tyler, you're the biggest murderer." Listening to her accusations, Tyler couldn't think of a single rebuttal. He was indeed a bastard, and he had wronged Florence. When the police arrived, they took everyone away. Florence's family was involved in illegal immigration, illegal transfer of assets, and intentional harm to Florence. Not only had to hand over all their property, but also had to spend several years in prison, which could be considered their deserved retribution. But after all this was over, Tyler couldn't be happy at all. Even though he had sent those who had hurt Florence to prison and made them pay for their crimes, he was still very sad. The person he hated the most now was himself. He still wanted to find Florence, but what face did he have? Florence should be very free now that she had left him. He shouldn't have bothered her anymore. His life became more and more depressed, and no matter how much people tried to persuade him, he couldn't improve. Until one surgery, Tyler made a mistake again. This time the hospital couldn't protect him either, so they had to revoke his position as director. And they also restricted him from performing surgery. Tyler knew this meant he might only be an ordinary doctor in the hospital for the rest of his life. Everyone had once been certain that he would become a successful person, but in the end, he had ruined everything himself. 17. Sitting in her coastal dormitory, Florence had just finished reading the letter from her head nurse. Her life had just begun to settle down here. Listening to the waves, she casually flipped through a medical book. After arriving here, Florence gave a copy of her mailing address to the head nurse. She would often write to Florence, telling her about the recent situation at the hospital. Although they were all trivial matters, most of them did not involve Tyler, probably for fear of upsetting her. But in this long letter, the head nurse told Florence about what had happened in the months since she left. Hearing about these people again, Florence felt as if it were a world away. Listening to the ending of these people's stories in the letter, it was as if a page had been turned in her life. Looking at the distant lighthouse, those memories seemed to have drifted away with the waves and completely disappeared from her life. Florence thought back to when she had first arrived in H City a few months ago. She had taken a dozen-hour train ride, and the scenery along the way was something she, a native of the north, had never seen before. As soon as she got off the train, a warm, humid sea breeze blew in her face. So winter could be warm. She arrived early, and a special car came to pick her up. A young, but very spirited and handsome man was waiting for her at the train station with her nameplate. "Hello, I'm Florence." The man was slightly stunned when he saw her, then reached out his hand. "Hello, my name is Reed." Along the way, Reed didn't let Florence carry anything extra, and enthusiastically introduced her to the surrounding buildings and attractions. Florence had never seen the sea before. She had always said she wanted to go, but was always delayed by various things. Now she saw it. Reed found that Florence liked the sea, and pointed to a row of colorful buildings ahead. "Those are your dormitories. They're all newly built, and in front of the dormitory is the sea. When you have nothing to do at night, you can go for a walk by the sea and catch some seafood." Florence looked at the sunset and the sea merging in the distance, a scene she had only seen in her dreams before. Reed looked sideways at Florence and was also dazzled by her smile. He stopped at a convenience store and asked Florence to buy some daily necessities. When Florence came out after choosing, Reed also came out of the flower shop next door. He smiled and gave Florence a tulip, just as a housewarming gift. You probably don't see flowers like this in the north. Florence had indeed never seen a tulip before. She lowered her head and smelled the fragrance of the flower. She had just arrived in H City, and she thought she would not be able to adapt, but it seemed that it was much better than she had imagined. Following the newly built coastal road, Reed with the sea breeze drove Florence to the dormitory building. Reed was a very measured person and only helped Florence put away her luggage before leaving without staying any longer. Florence looked at her brand new home, and her mood improved a lot. Pushing open the window, the sea was right in front of her, and she could hear the sound of the waves. These new experiences were something she had never experienced before. As Florence was looking out at the sea, she noticed that the car that had brought her downstairs had not left. Reed was standing beside the car, also looking at the end of the sea. She had no work arrangements for the next few days, so she went around the neighborhood. This branch of the hospital was located in the new district of H City, and it was not as bustling as J City, nor was it as dull. There was a vibrant atmosphere everywhere. When Florence rode her bike back to the dormitory building, she saw Reed there too. 18. Florence hadn't taken a step forward when the man smiled and greeted her. Florence took off her hat and walked towards him. "Are you here to see someone off too?" Reed hesitated for a moment before shaking his head. "No, I'm here to deliver your hospital uniform." Florence took it in her hands and realized it was a surgical gown. For a moment, she was a little dazed. She hadn't been in surgery for a long time. Florence stepped forward and asked, "Isn't there a mistake?" Reed shook his head and smiled. "No, the organization has reviewed your resume, and the hospital is in dire need of talent. It's a waste for you to just be a resident. So, after discussion, we hope you can take up the position of a surgeon and relieve more patients' suffering." Florence was momentarily speechless. She didn't expect that she would have the opportunity to be a surgeon again. She also didn't expect the organization to still want to use her. Although she had been practicing on pigskin and eggshells all these years, she hadn't been in the operating room for 3 years. Florence looked at the long-lost uniform, and her eyes welled up. Reed didn't expect her to react this way, and didn't know what to do for a moment. The handkerchief he had taken out just stopped in front of Florence. Florence smiled and took his handkerchief. "Thank you. I'll return it to you next time." Reed looked at Florence and was a little lost in thought, as if he had never seen such a gentle and bright girl before. After Florence went upstairs, she suddenly turned around. She looked at Reed and asked, "Which department are you in?" Reed was still in a daze, and only came back to his senses when Florence called him a second time. "You'll know when you start work." Florence didn't ask any more questions and went upstairs alone. Over the next few days, the dormitory gradually filled up with people from all over the country. The girl next door to Florence was from the Northeast, and she was straightforward and sunny, and the two of them quickly became friends. When Florence made new friends, she would always think of the head nurse in her heart, so she searched for some local dried seafood and fruits to send to the head nurse before work. She also left her contact information. Although she didn't specifically ask, the head nurse would definitely not easily reveal it to others. The two of them kept in touch frequently. When the head nurse learned that Florence had a new life and made new friends, she was genuinely happy for her. She also kept an eye on the news from J City and would tell her about it from time to time, mostly about the surgery on her arm. "I heard there's a surgeon in H City who is an expert in nerve repair surgery, but I don't know the exact information yet. I'll tell you as soon as I find out about this person." Florence soon took up her position. Although the hospital was newly open, there were many patients. Florence didn't get much rest for 2 consecutive days. That day, when she was not busy, she remembered that she hadn't returned the handkerchief to Reed. It was a pity that she helped him so much, but she didn't know which department he was in. In the afternoon, while the various departments were not busy, Florence went around to ask. But she went to several places, and no one said there was a doctor named Reed. Just as Florence was puzzled, she heard an old doctor joking. Our dean is called Reed, and he's not very old. Why don't you go and see him? Florence just thought it was a casual remark and didn't take it seriously. She thought that since she couldn't find him today, she would return it to him later. As soon as she walked out, while she was lowering her head to tidy up the handkerchief in her hand, she accidentally bumped into someone. Florence quickly apologized. Sorry. It's you? The familiar voice made Florence look up, and the other person was actually Reed, whom she had been looking for a long time. I was looking for you. Here, take this back. Reed took the handkerchief and looked at the current Florence. He sincerely praised, this uniform suits you better. The afternoon sun shone on Florence, and the white coat made her look like an angel. By the way, which department are you in? Florence saw that he wasn't wearing a white coat, but a Dongsan suit, as if he had just returned from a business trip. Reed smiled and led Florence to point to his office. I'm here. Feel free to come find me anytime. You're the dean? Florence exclaimed in surprise. Reed smiled and looked at her surprised expression, finding it a little funny. Don't I look like a dean? 19. Florence was startled. She really didn't expect the dean of the branch hospital to be so young. Both of them still had a lot of work to do. And after returning the handkerchief, Florence said goodbye to him. But Reed caught up with her and pulled out a tulip from somewhere. I saw it blooming so beautifully I bought it. I was afraid I would forget if I didn't give it to you. After saying that, Reed's ears turned a bright red and he left quickly. Only Florence and a tulip in full bloom were left in the light, blooming brightly. Days went by, one after another, ordinary yet upward. Because the department was going to introduce new equipment, Florence had to go on a business trip with Reed. This business trip also allowed Florence to see his professionalism, his strict control over medical equipment, and the performance requirements for each item. These were all areas that Florence had never been exposed to, and Reed never complained about her asking questions, instead patiently teaching her one by one. Florence had always been a good student, and almost immediately after something was explained in the morning, she could use it in negotiations in the afternoon. There was admiration in each other's eyes. In the end, they added a batch of new equipment to the hospital at a very fair price. There was one machine that Reed cherished particularly. Florence had never seen such a device before. Reed said it was the latest machine imported from abroad. As long as we can use this machine well, then many surgeries that couldn't be performed before can be carried out. This is not just a machine, it's also the hope of countless people. Florence didn't realize it at the time, but it was also her hope. After returning from the business trip, Florence received another letter from the head nurse, in which she said she had found the exact information about that dean. That person was Reed. Florence didn't expect that the person who could save her was right in front of her. But this matter was still very risky, and there were no successful cases in the country yet. Since the machine was transported back, Reed had almost lived in the hospital, working day and night to study the machine and constantly mocha with it. He was originally an expert in this field and had been studying abroad before, and he had returned to China resolutely to fill this gap in the country. This meant that there was no precedent for him to follow, and he could only explore forward on his own. All the doctors saw these things, and at first, a few older doctors were dissatisfied. But later, seeing his tireless efforts, they had nothing to say. They all knew that he was a real talent, an irreplaceable talent. After finishing her night shift, Florence was about to go back when she saw Reed standing at the end of the corridor. He stayed in the hospital all day and was even a little disheveled, but his eyes were still bright, as if they were glowing. Florence went forward to persuade him to take care of his body. I heard that you can already operate this machine. Reed's figure was a little lonely. Perhaps people like him were always lonely, and few people could understand his difficulties. Can I really save people with this machine? Looking at Reed's current appearance, Florence thought of herself when she first entered the operating room. Even though she had practiced thousands of times, she would still be nervous when it came to the real thing. She remembered that the patient was a little girl who had only said one sentence to her. "Sister, will you save me?" Being trusted by a patient was a great encouragement. Florence asked Reed, "Have you decided who you want to perform the first surgery on?" Reed shook his head painfully. "I can't choose." Florence looked at him and asked solemnly, "Dr. Reed, do you think I can be your first patient?" Florence unbuttoned her coat and revealed the scar on her arm. The shocking wound made Reed's heart ache. Looking at the hopeful light in Florence's eyes, Reed finally agreed. This was the first surgery of its kind in the country, and many experts came to learn. Before entering the operating room, Florence looked at the bright tulips beside her and walked in with a smile. "Dr. Reed, I believe you can do it." The surgery lasted 10 hours and was an unprecedented success. It was a breakthrough in medicine. 20. After the surgery, Reed and Florence's relationship grew closer and closer. They were people of like minds. Naturally, they had a lot to talk about, and they chatted freely about everything under the sun. On the day Florence was finally discharged from observation, Reed personally picked her up and took her back to the dormitory building. Reed found a small restaurant, and the two of them celebrated together. Looking at her gradually strengthening arm, Florence had once thought it was a fantasy to be able to recover. Now it seemed that with the development of technology, many impossibilities had become possibilities. Reed asked Florence if she had any wishes. Florence smiled brightly. "I want to exercise hard to recover and strive to return to the operating table as soon as possible." She had never dared to say this wish out loud before, but now it was almost within reach. Reed saw the tears in her eyes. At that moment, he hoped that Florence would only cry for joy in the future. Florence was rarely so happy and was much more lively. She asked Reed, "What about you? What's your wish?" The man propped his head up with his arm and said casually after drinking some wine, "I hope all of Florence's wishes can come true." Although the restaurant was noisy, this sentence clearly reached Florence's ears. The two looked at each other and seemed to be able to read the affection in each other's eyes. Florence had never thought about starting a relationship with anyone else. Everything she had given in the first half of her life had only brought her pain. This made her timid and fearful, and even when she realized that she had this thought, her first reaction was to nip this possibility in the bud early. But fate made her meet Reed. The two walked back along the beach from the restaurant, and the sea breeze sobered them both up a bit. Florence was always walking ahead of Reed. After walking for a while, he suddenly called out to her. The sky was full of stars, the moon was in the bay, and even the evening breeze was much gentler. Reed walked step by step towards Florence. "I have something I want to say to you. I'm a very lonely person, and I don't have any relatives in the country. I spent a lot of time just studying, and I was clumsy when I was in school, and I still am now. Although I'm a dean, I feel that I'm far from qualified. Since I've chosen the path of a doctor, I will continue to walk it. I'm telling you this because I think you'll understand me, and I also hope you understand my situation." The sound of the waves and the wind seemed to disappear, and Florence could only hear his voice. "I know you may not want to tell me about your experiences, and I don't expect you to be with me now. I just hope you can give me a chance to pursue you." Florence had never heard such a confession, and she never thought she would meet such love. She didn't refuse. She thought she should experience such wholehearted love once. Fortunately, this time, the person did not let her down. Reed was not a man who would make empty promises. His love was always reflected in the little things of everyday life. Reed would always pay attention to Florence's health, would pick her up and drop her off from work no matter the weather, and would always find time to eat with her, no matter how busy he was. The latest seasonal flowers were always displayed in Florence's department. Love is like raising flowers. Florence finally waited for such good love. Florence finally accepted Reed's proposal. 21. This was Florence's third year in H City, and everything was going well for her. She had just been promoted to chief physician, and her hand had recovered very well, allowing her to return to the operating table. Since she was able to perform surgery, her work schedule was packed almost every day. Although she was physically tired, Florence was still full of energy every day. She cut her long hair and left it shoulder length. She also followed the trend and permed her hair. and she looked completely different from before. H-City was also changing every year, and more people were coming here for opportunities. The empty land from before was now bustling with activity. The branch hospital had also made significant achievements in the past 3 years, and the J-City branch was planning to send people to learn and observe. The head nurse had specially requested this opportunity. The two of them had been corresponding for the past few years. What made Florence happiest was that her Mimi had been found. She had been taken home by the head nurse's cat and had given birth to a litter of kittens. The head nurse often sent her photos to look at. As long as she knew it was doing well, Florence felt relieved. Thinking that she would be reunited with her old friend in a few days, she felt inexplicably happy. On the other side, in J-City, someone else was tossing and turning in bed. Tyler had been vaguely looking forward to going to H-City to learn ever since he heard about it. He had also quietly inquired about Florence's news. Knowing that she had healed her arm and was back on the operating table, Tyler was genuinely happy for her. But thinking of the pain from a few years ago, he still couldn't let go. The dean had given him this opportunity specifically to let him cut off some of his thoughts. But Tyler still had a glimmer of hope in his heart, wondering if Florence would be willing to come back with him. He had restored the entire house to the way it was when Florence was there. Their wedding photo was hanging on the headboard, and the books that Florence loved most were still neatly arranged on the cabinet. There was even the old cat bed at the door. Tyler had raised another cat after Florence left, and it looked very much like the previous one. Tyler walked the same path that Florence had taken 3 years ago. With every step he took, he wondered what Florence was thinking when she did these things, and what Florence was doing now. After getting off the train, all the other colleagues went to the hotel to rest, but Tyler took a taxi to the branch hospital alone. With each step closer, his heart beat faster. He couldn't wait to see Florence now. The heavies in over the years made him breathless, and he couldn't see the fresh scenery outside the car until the car stopped at the door of the branch hospital. As soon as Tyler walked in, he saw several cats with name tags. They didn't look like abandoned stray cats, but rather like well-cared-for pets. They were all fat, just like the ones Florence used to keep. Florence must like this place very much. As soon as he walked in, he went to find Florence. The nurse explained, "Director Florence just went into surgery, and it will be a long time before she finishes. If you are here to see a doctor, you can see other doctors." Tyler waved his hand, indicating that he could wait alone. He watched people coming and going in the hospital, and just sat on a bench waiting for Florence to finish the surgery. Time passed minute by minute, and he had never felt time pass so slowly. He had waited outside for as long as Florence had been in surgery. He even seemed more anxious than the patient's family. Now Florence had become a living signboard of the branch hospital. She was indeed a person born for the operating table. With her own skills, she had quickly made a name for herself. Florence had always been a shining piece of gold, but she had been buried under the sand back then. Tyler looked at the introduction about her in the hospital and suddenly felt very ashamed. He had made no progress in his work for so many years and was already far from Florence. Perhaps he could have stood side by side with Florence in the past, but it was absolutely impossible now. 22. The operating room lights finally dimmed, and the door slowly opened. A woman in a surgical gown walked out. Tyler immediately stood up from his seat, but he dared only look from afar, unable to get closer. His legs felt as heavy as lead, and he could only stand there dumbfounded. Florence took off her mask, and Tyler finally saw the face he had been thinking about day and night for these 3 years. She was still as beautiful and bright as she was before, even more beautiful. It turned out that a person shining so brightly could be so attractive. Her hair was shorter, not as gentle as before. Her eyes were also brighter, no longer filled with dim light. The Florence now was both familiar and unfamiliar to Tyler, but anyone could see that she had become better. Florence seemed to be explaining something to her family, and Tyler couldn't hear. But he also wanted to hear Florence's voice again. When Tyler finally mustered up the courage to walk over, Florence turned and went into the cleaning room. Tyler stood there a little at a loss. How should he face Florence? How could he express his longing for her all these years? While Tyler was still thinking wildly, Florence came out of the cleaning room. Tyler hurriedly chased after her, only to find that there was another person beside her. The man was tall and not wearing a white coat, so he didn't look like he was from the hospital. He was walking side by side with Florence intimately, as if they were used to it. At that moment, all the emotions and longing that Tyler had accumulated over the past 3 years erupted uncontrollably. He stopped the two in public. "Florence, why are you holding this man's hand? Tell me, who is he?" Tyler's appearance caught Florence off guard. She didn't expect their reunion to be like this. Or rather, she had never thought that she would see Tyler again. There were people coming and going in the hospital, and many people knew Florence and Reed, but they didn't know who Tyler was. Reed didn't recognize the man in front of him, and his first reaction was to protect Florence. Seeing his protective action, Tyler's heart tightened. So the other party actually regarded him as someone who would hurt Florence? Florence looked at the old friend she hadn't seen in years, but there was no more ripple in her heart. She nodded politely and distantly to Tyler. "Hello, Dr. Tyler." Hearing this strange address, Tyler felt a chill in his heart. He never thought that the first words between them after reuniting would be like this. He couldn't believe that Florence would be so heartless to him. "Florence, I'm your husband." He took a step forward and tried to grab Florence, but Reed stood directly in front of Florence. "Sir, don't talk nonsense. Florence is my fiancée." Tyler was blinded by the ring on Florence's hand. "Impossible. No way. Florence is clearly my wife. You won't marry anyone else, will you?" 23. The three of them were standing in a place that was too conspicuous, and many gossiping eyes were looking at them. Florence couldn't persuade the two men, so she had to pull them outside. Tyler insisted on talking to Florence alone. Reed looked at Florence several times before reluctantly going to the side. Looking at Florence, who was so close, Tyler, who had a stomach full of words, didn't know where to start. "Florence, I've missed you all these years. I know about the child, and I've taught them a lesson. I've already avenged you and our child. Until I lost you, I realized that the person I've always loved has always been you, Florence. I really can't lose you. I know that saying these things now can't change anything, but I still hope you can give me a chance. I will definitely spend the rest of my life compensating you, and I will never let you suffer even a bit. Will you come back to J City with me?" Looking at the man who was begging in front of her, Florence couldn't imagine that she had been so sad and heartbroken for such a person. Fortunately, time had passed, and Tyler had long become a thing of the past for her. No matter what Tyler had done over the years, it had nothing to do with her anymore. But the man was still stuck in the past, clinging to those old memories and unwilling to let go. When Florence was hurt by her family, when she was injured, when she lost her child. During the most difficult times in Florence's life, Tyler had been by her side, but he had never protected her or comforted her once. He hadn't done it once before, so how could he do it now? Florence always believed that the best ending between the two of them was to never see each other again. Especially after Florence lost her child, her last bit of delusion about him had also dissipated. Through Florence's eyes, Tyler seemed to see the answer. Why was Florence's eyes so bright when she looked at that man, but different when she looked at him? Her eyes were dim and hopeless when she looked at him. Was she making Florence sad? Tyler didn't want to believe this result and preferred to deceive himself. He pointed at Reed beside him and asked, "Is it because of this person? Is it because of him that you don't want to be with me, right? Is it he who stole your heart?" He was so unwilling to accept the fact that Florence had fallen in love with someone else. Reed, who had been standing by, couldn't stand it anymore and strode over to stop Tyler's actions. "I wondered what Florence's ex-husband would be like, but I never imagined it would be a waste like you. No wonder she wanted to divorce you and never wanted to see you again." The last sentence completely angered Tyler. The two men started fighting, and the scene was out of control for a moment. "You're talking nonsense. Clearly the person Florence loves most has always been me. You're just a passerby now, and I'm her fiancé now." Florence was about to call the security guard, but the fight between the two men ended too quickly. Reed had been exercising regularly and had a background in fighting. while Tyler had been living a decadent life for years and didn't take care of his body. He was no match for Reed at all. Reed pressed him down and scolded him severely. It's Florence's right to choose who she's with, and it's also her right to choose who she breaks up with. Staying away from her current life is the best blessing for her. Tyler still refused to give up and tried to fight back, but he was quickly dragged away by the security guards who came running. Florence looked at Reed, who had just finished fighting, and was surprised that he had such a side. Reed patted the dirt off his coat and reached out to Florence. Your choice of men in the past is indeed questionable. Florence helped him tidy the hair on his head and looked into Reed's eyes. It's pretty good now. Reed put his arm around her shoulder and held Florence in his arms. It's very good. The two of them walked home side by side, and no one noticed Tyler's loneliness. 24. The next day was the day the representatives from J-City came to visit. Florence specially cleared her morning schedule to welcome everyone. Many people didn't recognize the confident and spirited Florence now. Dr. Florence, long time no see. Now you should be called Director Florence, added a colleague from the branch. You're even more beautiful now. Florence chatted with everyone, and when it was over, she looked around anxiously for Nurse Hazel. Seeing Hazel, she quickly walked over to the head nurse and excitedly took her hand. The two of them were bosom friends in J-City, now that they were reunited after a long separation. They didn't know where to start when they opened their mouths. The head nurse looked at Florence's arm first. Although she knew her old injury had healed long ago, she still couldn't help but feel uneasy and had to confirm it herself. Then she looked at Florence's radiant appearance and was almost moved to tears. When she left J-City, Florence was just a lonely person. She had just lost her child and was weak. Sometimes she would feel heartache even in her dreams. Now Florence had completely transformed into a different person. This was the way she should have been, shining brightly. Everything is fine. The two sisters hugged each other tightly, and the longing that had crossed the north and south finally took shape. Florence took everyone on a tour for the whole day, and everyone talked nonstop. They talked about the changes in medical care over the years, and about the convenient development of the North and the South. Although they were not in the same place, their hearts were together. I heard you're getting married? A gossiping colleague asked. Florence smiled lightly. It's next year. If you're free, you must come. I'll take care of all the travel and accommodation. The head nurse nodded repeatedly. Okay. She was completely relieved now that she saw Florence was doing well. Your decision to go south was the right one. Sometimes people really need to go out and see more in order to discover a better scenery. The head nurse looked at the people beside her and continued. Have you seen Dr. Tyler? Florence nodded. I saw him yesterday, but there's no way between us anymore. The head nurse nodded. Yes, that's how people are. They don't cherish what they have until they lose it. A while ago, I heard that the family member who hurt you was released from prison and even found Tyler. But Tyler drove him away. Florence naturally knew who it was, but she really didn't want to care anymore. She hoped that she would never have anything to do with him for the rest of her life. The people from J-City were only staying for a week. They thought nothing major would happen, and they would just leave after the visit. But unexpectedly, something unexpected happened at the last minute. In the afternoon, the hospital received a patient with a high fever and an unknown lung infection. By night, the patient had died. Patients in the same ward also developed similar symptoms. The hospital immediately determined that this was definitely not a simple fever, but a malignant infection, and immediately sealed off the hospital. At this time, the medical staff from J-City were about to board the train to leave. They happened to see this news on the news. Florence organized all the doctors in the department to be on high alert to protect themselves and their patients. But just then, she saw someone she didn't expect. 25. Tyler, what are you doing here? The hospital is already locked down. You can't go out. Tyler had no protective gear on and just looked at Florence. Then he asked her, Tyler, a doctor at the First People's Hospital in J-City, reports for duty and requests to join this emergency action. Florence stood there, not knowing what to say for a moment. Florence, I will never leave you again this time. The hospital had been closed down, and Florence couldn't change that. She could only order, "Go inside and put on your protective gear." Before dawn, more than a dozen similar cases had occurred in the hospital, and the source had not been identified in time. For a time, there was panic in the hospital, but the doctors couldn't panic, and the nurses couldn't panic. They were the reassurance of these patients. The originally scheduled critical surgeries had to be guaranteed to continue, and the patient's treatment could not be delayed. Before dawn, a car drove into the hospital against the traffic. People wearing protective clothing got out of the car. Reed went to meet them personally. The doctors from J City had all returned. Quentin, a doctor from the First People's Hospital in J City, volunteered to come and help. Parker, a doctor from the First People's Hospital in J City, volunteered to come and help. Hazel, head nurse of the First People's Hospital in J City, volunteered to come and help. Reed looked at the doctors who were just like him and didn't know what to say for a while. He stood in front of the doctors and bowed deeply. "Thank you all." This virus was devastating and came on suddenly. Although the hospital had resolutely implemented a lockdown policy, there was still a steady stream of patients being sent in. The entire medical system was operating beyond its capacity. After working around the clock for 3 days, everyone was starting to feel the strain. That afternoon, another female patient was sent in. Her condition was critical, and Reed performed the surgery. Because she was sent too late, and because she had other illnesses, she unfortunately did not survive. Florence had a bad feeling, so after finishing work, she went to the door of the operating room to wait for Reed. Sure enough, Reed came out looking dejected. Florence understood immediately and gave him a comforting hug. At that time, the family members rushed over from outside. Florence didn't look carefully. They were two windswept elderly people. They had no other choice but to persuade them to accept their fate. "Georgia, my Georgia, how could you just leave?" The old man couldn't bear such a blow and grabbed Reed's hand, refusing to let go. "You must not have saved my daughter properly. My daughter is so young. How could she have died? It can't be." Reed didn't resist the old man's beating. Florence was always protecting him, but Reed pushed her away and asked Florence to go to a safe place. "Please calm down. People can't be resurrected after death. You give me back my daughter." Florence suddenly stopped, as if she had heard a familiar voice. It wasn't until he lifted his hair that Florence recognized him as her father. The moment Florence's father recognized her, he lunged at Florence. "You bitch, it's all your fault. You killed your sister. You just wanted George's life." Reed rushed over to pull him away, but he didn't know where this man got so much strength. Reed fell to the ground directly, and Florence's father, apparently mentally unstable, took out a long iron rod from somewhere and was about to stab Florence in the chest. At the critical moment, Tyler appeared and blocked in front of Florence. Blood flowed out immediately, and Florence stared wide-eyed at the place where Tyler was injured. At that moment, it seemed to overlap with the time when Florence saved Tyler many years ago. Only this time, it was not her standing in front. Doctors and security guards immediately surrounded them. Tyler held Florence's hand and smiled. "I finally paid you back what I owed you. Tyler. Tyler." In the end, Tyler was successfully rescued. The iron rod didn't penetrate very deeply and didn't damage any vital parts. The person who performed the surgery was Florence, which meant she had saved Tyler's life again. When Tyler woke up, his first words were, "I'll never be able to repay what I owe you." And the patient who was sent that day was Georgia. The two elderly people who looked like vagrants were Florence's parents. Florence still couldn't believe that her own parents wanted to kill her. After they were released from prison, they had been trying to find someone else to suck blood from. Unfortunately, they couldn't rely on Tyler anymore. And when they heard that Florence was now in the South, they followed the train all the way down. It was just a pity that they didn't have much money when they just arrived in H City. They had been traveling for a long time and were in poor condition. They found out too late and died on the operating table. Florence's father was sentenced to life in prison for intentional injury. Florence went to see her mother afterwards, and she didn't understand why her parents were so partial. Florence's mother was also crazy at that time, and she could only live in a ward. When she saw Florence, she was very scared. "You're a disaster. It's all your fault. If I hadn't given birth to you, your father wouldn't have found other women. You're bad. Georgia is good. Georgia is the best. Dad loves Georgia." Looking at the crazy woman, Florence seemed to be relieved for a moment. She was also a woman who had been miserable all her life, but she just couldn't save herself. When Tyler's illness recovered, a special car came to pick him up. Before leaving, Tyler didn't see Florence, but instead wanted to see Reed. Florence didn't know what they talked about, but Reed told her. "Maybe some people and some things can never be let go, but he won't disturb us anymore." Florence asked, "What did he give you?" Reed took out a thick red envelope. "It's the gift money for our wedding." Spring was in full bloom, and the virus that had swept the country was also brought under control. Human selflessness once again overcame the ruthlessness of natural disasters. The two of them walked along the Golden Beach, and they continued to walk happily like this.